Hi everybody, this is Frank Leone again, and it's a pleasure to be back with you for the third session of Frank Fridays. And I really enjoyed the last two and had a chance to receive some of the comments from people, and we're extremely pleased that everybody seemed happy with the information that I shared. So we'll try to do a little bit more today. In any event, just to review, I'm Ryan Leone's father. And some weeks ago, Ryan asked me if I would be interested and willing to record some videos on his YouTube channel about my experience as a father going through what he went through for so many years. And I recognized right away that that would be a very nice opportunity to speak out to a lot of people and perhaps get some people more sensitive to what things are like on the family side of things, that addiction is indeed a family disease, it's not an individual disease, and hopefully I can share my insights in a way that might be of value to many different people that view these videos. So that's the background. When we last left off, Ryan was actually back in his junior year of high school, had done one stint in Aspen Ranch in Utah, in very rural Utah, and was back home and started off fairly well, but was starting to fade a little bit. But I want to pause away from that for a couple minutes and tell another story which I think has an awful lot of interest to it, and it goes back to 1989. At the time, Ryan was still 3 years old, and we were living in Massachusetts still. We moved to Santa Barbara in just a few months after that, and we went down to Florida. My parents lived in Florida in the last 20 years of their lives on the West Coast near Tampa and St. Petersburg. And we went down to see them, and we decided to take an afternoon off, my wife Diane and I and Ryan, to go over to Busch Gardens, which is a very well-known theme park down there in Tampa. And before we left, my father, who was then about 87 years old, said to me, "Oh gosh, you got to be really careful at Busch Gardens, Frank. There's a lot of abductions of young children that go on there." And I pretty much wrote that off as typical elderly grandparents being overly concerned about their beloved grandchild, but I acknowledged same, and we went there and really didn't think about it very much. So we got to Busch Gardens and had an enjoyable day, and Ryan was at an age where he was really enjoying himself, the different animals that were there and the different scenery and so forth. And at one point, we went into an exhibit area, and the exhibit was way at the end of a long, narrow pathway. And that exhibit area was crescent-shaped, like that, where you could walk through and see various displays on the wall. And my wife, Diane, and I and Ryan were the only three in there at the time. And we were looking at some of the exhibits, and all of a sudden we looked down, and Ryan wasn't there anymore, which is a bit unusual because Ryan was not a child that tended to scoot away from his parents very often. So we wrote it off as he's probably a few steps away and looked for him. Couldn't find him anywhere in this small exhibit. Remember, the three of us were the only three, as far as I could tell, that were in there. So we went outside and didn't see him immediately as well. So started to get worried. I mean, there was nobody outside, there was nobody inside. It was a very isolated area of the park. And sometimes when you're under pressure, you make the right decision, and sometimes you don't make the right decision. And in this case, looking back these many years later, fortunately, I think I made a reasonably good decision. At that point, there was three ways to go from where we were standing. There was a pathway to the left, a pathway straight ahead, and a pathway to the right. And all of them were sort of narrow sidewalk kinds of paths with trees and bushes and brushes on each side of it. You couldn't see anything but the pathways. So I had to make a decision where I was going to go look for Ryan. And very randomly I said, well, I'm going to go down the first pathway, the one to the left, and Diane, you stay here and wait. We need to have somebody here right where this all started in case Ryan is nearby and comes back. So he said, you wait here, I'm going to run down there and see if I can track him down somewhere or see if I can find other people that I can get help us to find Ryan wherever he might be. So it took me probably 15, 20, 25 seconds to get through that pathway out to this big opening. And probably everybody watching this has been to an amusement park of some sort in their life and knows that in these big openings there's rides and there's displays and there's all sorts of food options and so forth and so on, and there's hundreds of people going in every direction one way or the other. So I come out of that area and I just see this mass of people, and out of the corner of my eye, way over on the left peripheral side, I see a woman carrying Ryan in her arms, and Ryan is holding this giant soft drink in a plastic container. And I saw them just before they would have disappeared out of sight. So I ran over to the left and intercepted them. And I remember distinctly to this day, even though it is 31 years ago, or 30 years ago, I remember distinctly to this day that I said, "That's my son you have." And immediately it was clear to me that she wasn't relieved, but she was scared by my being there. You know, instead of saying, "Oh, what a relief, I just found him running by himself," she just sort of stared at me and was tongue-tied, wasn't able to say anything. So I knew that probably there was an abduction that had taken place. The key word is probably. You can never say for certain that there was. And Ryan, who, as I think I shared in a previous video, seldom cried as a child. It was just rather remarkable, in fact. But in this instance, all of a sudden he started crying, and I just grabbed him out of her arms, and I had a major decision to make at that point. Do I try to find security? Do I grab her and hold her and scream out security? Or do I let it go? And it was a very difficult decision, because all at once I was processing a lot of information. If I let her go and she was doing this kind of thing, this could happen to other children and their families. If I didn't let her go, it would have been very hard for us to prove that she did anything inappropriate. She could have easily said, "I found this young child running, and I picked him up and I was bringing him over to security so that he could be reunited with his family." And furthermore, I knew that my wife was sitting there waiting for us 75 yards away, and I knew that every second she was becoming more and more anxious as she was wondering, is Ryan around? Is he safe and is he okay? And is what my father said to us actually true? So I made the decision not to do anything, just to take Ryan and bring Ryan back to his mother. And we got back there, and of course that ended our day at the amusement park. But before we left, we went to security, because at the very least, I realized now that we had Ryan in hand, it should at least be reported. I could give security a description of the woman, and they should know about it. And the remarkable thing about our interaction with security that afternoon was they told us that never in the history of the park, and the park had probably been there for decades, has an abduction ever occurred, which really rung false to me. It really didn't seem possible that in such an ideal place to abduct young children, that something had never taken place. But you could see what they were doing. They just didn't want that to get out there in the public domain. So our visit to security basically didn't do any good. So anyhow, the story didn't end there, amazingly enough. A couple months later, this happened in March of 1989. A couple months later, it was probably May, just a week or two before we moved to California. There was these little postcards that you would get in the mail. And those postcards would often have photos of young children that were missing. But this particular postcard had a photo of a woman that they were looking for that had been suspected of abducting young children. And I looked at it, and sure enough, I was 99.9% sure that that woman in that photo was the woman that we ran into that day 2 months earlier in Tampa. And we were back in Massachusetts when we got the postcard. So I had another decision to make. And this time, looking back, I probably made the wrong decision. But either I follow up on this in some way or I don't. And the inclination was, of course, I want to follow up, because the information that I give authorities may be helpful in identifying this woman's tracks and reinforcing the fact that there may have been another abduction that was in process right down there in Tampa. But, that day turned to the next day, and I didn't get around to it, and then all of a sudden we were moving, and it never happened. So I didn't do that. But there's even more to the story. About 2 years later, by this time we had been living in Santa Barbara for a couple years, I was looking in, I believe it was the Santa Barbara newspaper, and there was an article in it, an article that was like an AP article that went national. And that article talked about this couple in Berkeley, California, that were apprehended for child abductions. And there was a picture of the male and the female there, and I looked and says, this sure does look like that same person again. So it ended well in that this person got caught, and we got Ryan back, and it probably scared the heck out of Ryan, even at that young age of 3.5. But that said, learned some important lessons. And one of those lessons is how fragile life can be, and how a matter of inches or a matter of seconds can really make a difference in a person's entire life. If I had chosen path 2 or path 3, or had taken longer to even come up with the plan to go down a path, we would have never seen Ryan. If we had gotten there probably 5 seconds later, this woman that was disappearing off to the left would have probably disappeared off to the left, and I would have never seen her nor Ryan. But by sheer luck, I picked the right path, and by sheer luck, I got there seconds before she would have disappeared from view. So to me, it's a startling story. My life would have been very different. Ryan's mother's life would have been very different. He's our only child. And Ryan's life would have been very different. God knows where he would have grown up or what kind of family he would have been placed in. Placing is using the word loosely, probably sold to some family for a sizable amount of money. But in any event, I thought that was a telling story to share at the outset of this week's presentation. So anyhow, that said, let's go back to, let me think now, this would be the fall of 2002, and Ryan was back in school. And you may remember in the last session we talked about how we went to China, and Ryan was doing pretty well at that time. We came back, Ryan went to his junior prom, I remember, and we got through the Christmas season pretty well. But things started breaking down quickly after the first of the year. Ryan started to really, at least from our perspective, things may have broken down before that, and they probably did, but by the time we realized that Ryan had fallen back into a lot of his bad habits of serious drug abuse, some alcohol, but mostly drug abuse, and just generally bad behavior. It was January, February, and March, and he was living at home some of that time. He had, by and large, stopped going to school again, or certainly wasn't trying. That first semester he actually did well, a smart guy, and he did well academically. So once again, we get to this fork in the road where we have to make a decision about what to do with him. By this time, Ryan is 17 years old, and the only thing that we really knew what to do was to send him right back to where he was. We had the ability, as parents of a 17-year-old, to send Ryan back to Aspen Ranch in Utah. So we had to repeat the entire same cycle. Had to get in touch with Aspen Ranch, had to apply for admittance there. He got in, had to get the escort service, if you will, not an escort service the way a lot of people define it, but these two brawny guys that come in and take you out of your bed at 3 a.m. and bring you to the airport and head out to Utah. We had to go through all that. And by the way, they do not want you in the house when this occurs because the child could resist and bad things can happen. So we had to get up ourselves about 2:30 and actually get in the car and drive a couple streets away. We recruited a friend of Ryan's who, remarkably, looking back at it now, didn't spill the beans to Ryan, to make sure that Ryan got home that night. And so he was sleeping at the house, Ryan's friend, and we dragged him along so he'd be in our car. And the three of us waited for 45 minutes or so, went back, Ryan was no longer there, and he was on his way back to Utah. So anyhow, that said, it's a very strange day for a parent. On one sense, it's a great relief that he is going to be in good hands, that he is going to be being taken care of. On the other hand, though, there is a concern that how sad it is that he has to be with 2 escorts in an airplane, going to Utah, going right back there after he had gotten out of there in fairly good graces at the time. So it was mixed emotions, but I think as any parent of a young person or even a fellow adult going through addiction issues, there's a certain sense of relief when you know that they are most likely out of harm's way, at least for the time being. To say nothing of the eternal hope that this latest chapter in his life, going back to Aspen Ranch, may ultimately do some good. So that was the experience there. I just want to take a look at where we're at here. Okay. All of that said then, he went to Aspen Ranch in March of 2003. And I immediately struck up a deal with him. I said, Ryan, you're not going to leave Aspen Ranch until you complete all your high school coursework. Because at Aspen Ranch, you could take coursework, it's really almost a school basically, and get enough courses in that you can qualify to take a GED. So I said, here's the deal. As soon as you complete that, if everything else is on par, then you can come out, we'll take the GED, you'll get that. So indeed, he went in March and was done in July, early July. And we arranged to have him take his GED as soon as I picked him up. So I had to fly back to Utah, drive 2 hours and 45 minutes down to Aspen Ranch where he was. And then we went to, of all places, Brigham Young University, because that's where the GED was being offered the next day in that area. Went back to Brigham Young, stayed in Provo the previous night, and Ryan went in and took his GED the next morning while I sort of roamed the campus all day long. But he did complete his work, he did get his GED, and we did go back to Salt Lake City and go back to Santa Barbara, so we're home. However, there's a bit of an issue here. He is now a year ahead of his high school class. He's mid-17s age-wise, but he wasn't supposed to graduate until 2004, and this is July of 2003. So the question is, what is Ryan going to do? What's the next step? We certainly were not comfortable in saying, well, just hang out or try to find a job and live at home. We didn't want him to be anywhere else either. So we had to look for some other option for him to, something for him to do starting the following school year, which by this point was only a matter of 5 weeks, 4 or 5 weeks away. So somehow, and I don't recall exactly how, I found this program in, of all places, Worcester, Massachusetts. I say of all places because not that many years before, I had gone there to serve as in an administrative role at the University of Massachusetts Medical Center, which is in Worcester. So I had actually worked in Worcester for many years and had lived there for a few months while we were looking for a house elsewhere in the greater Boston area. So I knew Worcester, but it was a gap school, and what it was portrayed as a school that young people go to take a year off between high school and college, to take some coursework if they so desire, to get a job and to learn a little something about what life is like in the workaday world, to interact with other people, and so forth. So I said, well, this sounds like something promising, got on the phone with them, and then I had to go up there while Ryan was still at Aspen Ranch to check it out, to meet with them and so forth, and it looked pretty decent to me, looked pretty appropriate to me. So once we got back, then Ryan and I had to go in early August back to the school in Worcester so Ryan could be interviewed to be admitted there. And actually Ryan was in pretty good shape at that point. His head was in a good place, and he did well in the interview and was accepted. So early September or late August or whenever it began, that fall of 2003, Ryan and I get in an airplane and we go to Boston and we rent a car and I drive him out to Worcester and bring him over to this school and look around, and there's a lot of other people, half male, half female, most of whom seem like pretty solid young people. And I dropped him off and left his suitcase there in this meeting house where they all met up. And I left and got in my car and started going around the block to head back to Boston to catch the flight back home to California. And sure enough, as I'm driving out, there's this little park a half block away from where I dropped Ryan off, and Ryan's there with 5 or 6 of his new classmates. And as I'm driving by, I could see the 4 or 5 of the other people are sitting down on a bench, and Ryan is standing there entertaining them, telling them stories, doing all sorts of motions. They're laughing, and it was a heartwarming moment at that point, and saying, my gosh, he's been here for 12 minutes, and he's already out there telling stories and entertaining people. So I think in some ways the die was cast for the year 2019 and beyond that. So anyhow, that said, Ryan went through the program and was actually doing well. The first reports we got were that he was fitting in well. At one point, got a phone call from Ryan. I wrote him almost every day, and he called us frequently, and we spoke, and it was a relatively good period. He was doing something constructive, a way for him to get past his past and prepare himself perhaps to go to a junior college or a college the following year. So we're back in California. We get good reports. Ryan calls one day and says, "Dad, I met somebody." And I'm saying, well, that's nice. You met somebody, I'm sure you did. But he had a girlfriend at this point, and he seemed to be very happy about that. And the people at the school actually were talking to me, just giving me a progress report. It says it was really sweet. They sit down next to each other at all the group meetings and so forth and so on. And of course, we went there again, as we did in Aspen, both during Ryan's first and second stint there. Diane and I went back to Worcester to go to Parents' Weekend up at the school, and had a chance to meet this very nice young lady, and met very briefly her parents as well, met the other kids. It seemed like a pretty decent place. Ryan was sharing an apartment with at least one other, maybe 2 other guys, and it was sort of in a sketchy part of town, but aside from that, it seemed okay. So things were okay at this point. Went back, and we get to about November, and things started to get, as has been happening historically, shaky again. And we hear from the school, and Ryan's not doing that well, and he's sleeping through and not going to his job a lot, and the people that he's employed with are getting very impatient with him, and so forth and so on. There was no particular mention of drugs. I would find out later that they were commonplace not only with Ryan, but throughout the school at that point. But it was pretty hard dealing with that from so far away in that period of time after there had been so much what it turned out to be false hope. And that tends to be another recurrent message, is the roller coaster ride that parents and loved ones of young addicts tend to go through, is that you want so badly for good news to be presented to you that every time there is some good news, you take it to the bank and you're real excited and you think maybe this is the start of what you've been hoping for all along, only to be disappointed again. And that's how it was there. So in any event, that said, Ryan was still enrolled there when the Christmas break occurred, and actually brought his girlfriend back to Santa Barbara with him. She came back for the Christmas holidays, and they spent the holidays with us. And let me get to the very end of this session. After the Christmas holidays, they both had plane tickets to go back to Worcester, back to Boston, and then they would take some other mode of transportation out to Worcester, about 40 miles west of Boston. And I dropped them off at the airport on probably a Monday morning at about 8 o'clock or so. And I just had this hunch. Parents can get hunches with things, that something may have been a little bit strange about this. So instead of getting in my car and driving away, I pulled up in the parking lot right in front of where the main entrance and exit of the airport was, and waited a while. And sure enough, guess what? About half hour later, they come walking out, some car comes driving along, picks them up, they get in the car, and they go speeding away. So Ryan does not know that I know, and therefore his mother knows, that they're still in Santa Barbara, but they elected not to get on the plane, but elected to stay in Santa Barbara for God knows how much longer. So what's next? Well, you're going to have to tune in next week, and we'll find out what happens when Ryan and this new girlfriend decide that they're not going back to Massachusetts, but instead are staying in Santa Barbara. So See you next week, and thanks a lot.
Palabra.